This is Roger. Cancer vaccines. I had first heard about the idea of cancer vaccines 10 years ago when I was doing a lot of work with the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. At the time, they were being developed in connection with blood cancers. Fast forward to today, and we now have vaccines that are being used in a wide variety of cancers, including solid tumors. So I was vaguely aware that there was such an idea and such a thing out there. I eventually came across it through a lot of research and talking and going through my network and talking to other cancer patients, cancer patient advocates who let me know about the idea of the vaccines. And I came across an organization here in the San Francisco Bay Area that it's a nonprofit that actually is engaged in helping getting cancer vaccines for patients. Now, let me explain what I mean by a vaccine, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience. So traditional standard of care, as we know, is chemotherapy, radiation, surgery. I had chemo and surgery. There's also an immunotherapy component to it, which is similar but a little bit different than what I'm talking about, and oftentimes used in conjunction with a vaccine. But this is something a little bit outside that. The cancer vaccine is a way of stimulating your own immune system so that it recognizes the cancer cells as foreign and attacking it as it would any other foreign cell. It's sort of the reason that cancer isn't contagious, because your body will recognize something from someone else's body as foreign. So we need to be able to get our immune system to do that. And in my opinion, that's the real cure. Now, it's not perfect. I mean, even when it works, the cancer is a shapeshifter, and it can sometimes mutate and change and develop resistance even to a vaccine. But I think it's very promising. And at this point, I had gone through everything standard of care had to offer me. So after I'd learned about this and had studied it and had talked to the people involved, I went back to my oncologists, my two main oncologists from two major hospitals associated with major educational institutions. And both of them said that this was good science. It was solid science, but not something that they could administer because it's not standard of care. I would have to do that outside of those institutions. And that means I have to find a doctor that's willing to do it. And in fact, the doctor, the oncologist that I did find that was willing to do it, he was very clear too. He says, I can't do this through my medical institution. I'm only doing this on my own time out of intellectual interest. So it has a long ways to go here in the US. And I'll talk a little bit more about that now or in a future session, because the FDA has definitely played a big role in slowing down the adoption of this new and basically harmless and life-saving technology, potentially. Now, so the first component to this is it requires this next-gen sequencing testing. We have to test the mutations at a much more micro level and understand exactly what the mutations are, which amino acids are out of place, and based on that, the labs can prepare peptides. Now, so number one is to find targets. Now, unfortunately, with pancreatic cancer, you don't really get good tissue samples because the cancer cells as a percentage of the tumor is typically lower than other types of cancers, just the nature of pancreatic. So it took a little bit of trouble to get a good tumor sample and then to wrestle it away from the lab where it was being held. That's a problem every patient that I've talked to that's gone through this has had with every single lab. It's just not a standardized process yet. So it takes a little bit of trouble to actually get the tissue, get it off to the testing companies. And for me, the first one that looked at it, they said, look, we can't find good targets. We've got 6 targets for you, and we like to have 15 before we go to the trouble of developing a personalized vaccine. So that was a bad day. However, we found a company in another country that had a technology which I don't think even existed at the time I was diagnosed, but did by the time I had surgery, I had tissue taken and shipped off to them. And by this time, I'd had the pathology lab pretty much seal trained to send tissue when I asked them to. So they did, and it went off to the new lab in Europe. And they came back with the new technology, and they found 6 really good targets. So I had a total of about 11 or 12 targets, and these are actual mutations that they believe that a vaccine might be effective in stopping the cancer. So now I've got good targets. Now, when you hear about cancer vaccines, it's all over the press. You probably have heard about the Moderna and the Merck and the BioNTech. Those are called mRNA vaccines, and they work a little bit differently than what I got. I got a neoantigen peptide vaccine, and I won't pretend to understand too much about the science. I will tell you that I heard about the mRNA vaccine early in this, and I fought pretty hard to get them. I pestered Merck and Moderna to death to sell me that vaccine, give me that vaccine. In fact, I even showed up at the founder of Moderna's doorstep when he was giving a talk and asked him, why can't I have this? So I was pretty insistent, and the answer was pretty consistently no. Get into a clinical trial and you can have it, but otherwise not. And I tried to get into the trials and I could not. So the biggest reason probably I got the neoantigen peptide vaccine is because no one would give me the other one. But on top of that, what I understand from my friends who are molecular biologists, they say the science might be a little bit better in neoantigen peptide. They tell me that it just might have a better chance of working. It's a little more personalized than the mRNA vaccine, which attempts to train your own immune system to develop the antibodies, as opposed to the neoantigen peptide, which sort of forces that reaction through the adjuvants. Anyway, so that was what I was going to go with. Now, step one, I got targets. I've got I've got a foundation that's going to help me get the vaccine. I've got a doctor lined up that's willing to administer it. I've got a lab that's willing to manufacture it. It really does take a village. I got one more hurdle to clear, and that's the Food and Drug Administration, because this is not standard of care. It's not an approved therapy. The Food and Drug Administration is now subject to a regime called expanded access or compassionate use. And in order for the FDA to approve a therapy, a physician would have to certify that the disease is incurable, and we've tried everything else and there's nothing else that'll work. It's a pretty strong certification to the FDA that look, this guy's going to die anyway, let him try this, is basically the idea in FDA language. And it's actually kind of a depressing thing to read that certification, to be honest with you. But I have that certification, and we submitted it. And there's also a subset of expanded access applications that allows these things to be approved on a bulk basis. Otherwise, you could die waiting for the FDA to get around to approving it. And in fact, half the people that pay for the vaccine I got do die before the FDA lets them take it. It just takes that long. And it's not the approval so much as FDA rules require several months of testing. So it was 6 months from the time I paid for this vaccine. And that's the other weird thing. It's a clinical research study, but it's odd because normally patients don't pay to get into a research study. You're giving the data. That's what, it's not treatment, it's data. But on this one, it's so expensive and so new, someone has to defray the costs, and that someone is the patient. So 6 months from the time I paid to it until I actually was scheduled before it could be manufactured, gone through the extensive, rigorous FDA testing protocols, and be released for administration. The vaccine is kept at a very cold temperature, something like -70 C, and it's taken out the day before it thaws. So the day before my first dose was to start, I get a call from the foundation, and it says, I have bad news for you. The FDA changed their mind. They're not going to let you go through with this. They're not going to give you this vaccine. So that's 6 months of waiting and doing nothing else. Putting all your chips on black was a mistake. We're just going to have to throw this away. You can't get this vaccine. And I showed up at the doctor's office the next day anyway, because I would have given myself the vaccine at that point. Who cares at that point what the FDA says? What jury is going to convict me? But fortunately, they managed to re-secure that approval. I still don't know why. Some cigar chomping bureaucrat decided to withdraw my approval the day before because they had questions that they couldn't ask in the last 6 months. It was a little bit of unnecessary stress at the end, but I don't know how it is that I got it, and I probably don't want to know. All I know is I started taking the doses in February of 2023. I will tell you they are painful shots, and it's 4 shots each dose. But I have a different relationship with pain at this point than I did 3 years ago. So I've gone through several months of this. I've got 2 more months left. I'll finish this up in August, and I'll be finished with the vaccine. Now, how do we know if it's working? How do we know if this vaccine is actually generating the response that they want? Because so far this has been generally not too successful, depending how you measure success. And it's a little bit like proving a negative, because if somebody gets the vaccine and dies, well, then you know it wasn't successful. If they get the vaccine and continue to be no evidence of disease, as I sit here today, well, was that the vaccine, or is that just something that would have happened anyway? I don't know. But I do know that it's good science. My doctors like it. The only problem with it is that the FDA hasn't approved it, so insurance won't cover it. So it's just not available to all the people that it would help. And that's something that we really need to change sooner rather than later. And hopefully the research they get out of my trial, or not trial, study actually, will speed that process, although I sort of doubt it. Anyway, there is a test that they do. They do a blood test about 3 months in to determine whether you're having a response. I was having a weak response to 6 targets, which that sounds bad, but it's actually good because it's better than nothing. It means that it is working, and it means it might work even better if I continue to get the shots. If I had not had any response, I would not have continued with the shots, because there's not a zero cost to it. They're painful, and if they don't work, I won't do it. So I'm on a path, and we'll go back in August, get that blood test again, and see if my response is even better. Now, I say there's no really downside to this. It's sort of like, well, first of all, the shots are painful, and it's a little like a flu shot. I mean, and it varies widely, not only among different patients, but even for me, I never really kind of know. But generally, the day I get the shot, it'll kick in about 3 hours later. So I know I've got that kind of window if I need to do any work. I usually go to the gym right after the shot because I know I'm not going to, later. And I think it also helps because we got to get it into the lymphatic tissue. And I think movement, swimming for me, I think would be really good to that's just my own theory. I have no science to back that up. That's just my view. Anyway, and then the side effects hit about 3 hours later, and it's just like mild flu, headache, fatigue, it's hard to sleep, stuff like that. I had one, and I had probably the mildest reaction, they said, of anybody they'd given this vaccine to. I had one day that I had a much stronger reaction where I had chills and shivering. In fact, I was shaking so much I really couldn't even work anymore the rest of the day. I couldn't hold the phone. I couldn't type a message. But that was only one day I had a kind of a tough reaction. And, really a couple of Tylenol and manages it just fine. And then I feel kind of lousy for the next few days after. It takes about a week before I'm back to normal. And oddly enough, I've noticed my blood sugar goes up on days I get the shot and stays there for like 3 days and then drops back down. I don't know why. I guess maybe it's cortisol. So, but relatively mild. I mean, nothing like the chemo that I got. Nothing like that. And I'm sure milder than a lot of other therapies. Now, there's a second piece to this. I mentioned the immunotherapy before. So the nature, in my simple layman's mind, I really think you need 3 things to kill a cancer cell, to kill cancer in this war, and it is a war on cancer. One, you have to have enough white blood cells so that the cancer doesn't overwhelm your immune system. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Number two, those cells have to recognize the cancer as foreign. And number three, they have to be able to get around the cancer's evasion techniques, one of which is hiding from the immune response through what they call checkpoints, PDL, PDL1 primarily, and there's others. Well, there are drugs now, and it's been a huge advance, one of the few in cancer therapy, I understand, in what they call checkpoint inhibitors. And these drugs basically remove that ability of the cancer cell to hide from your immune system. And when it works spectacularly well. And sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes it's toxic. And lately, or more recently, I should say, these checkpoint inhibitors have been combined so that they're far more effective, but they're also far more toxic. And the vaccines are at least twice as effective when you combine them with the checkpoint inhibitor, because remember my three things. Well, you got enough T cells, they recognize the cancer as foreign, but what if the cancer has, got this evasion protein on its cell surface? Well, the checkpoint inhibitor removes a third, so you can see it's way more effective. In fact, I know a startup entrepreneur developing these who claims that without the checkpoint inhibitors, 50% response rate, with it, 80 or 90. So it's that big a deal. And I don't know if his numbers are right. That's all anecdotal. And in fact, I think the data from the vaccine trials probably wouldn't back that up. But again, that's backward-looking data. That's old. Going forward, we have new technology. So it's very promising. So you might be saying, well, of course, then you took the checkpoint inhibitors. And in fact, the doctor that administered this to me advocated quite strongly that I should take the checkpoint inhibitors. My oncologist who oversaw this said it was up to me because he acknowledged there's some toxicity and it's got to be my decision. And based on my research, I was very concerned about toxicity because about 1 in 100 people will die from this drug, is what I understand. Haven't verified that data. I've heard it from professionals in the field. And a much higher percent, something like 25%, are going to have some sort of adverse reaction. So I managed to find a test administered by an oncologist that will tell you what your likelihood of an adverse reaction to a checkpoint inhibitor is. And based on that test, I am highly likely to have a grade 4 adverse reaction to a checkpoint inhibitor. That means I would develop, with one dose, I would probably develop an autoimmune disease, at least one, that would last me the rest of my life. And some people say, what's the big deal? You can treat an autoimmune disease, although I know of people who have died from autoimmune diseases, and I know of people who have died within days of getting this drug from an autoimmune disease. So it is a big deal for me. And I decided not to step in front of that moving truck, and I did not get the checkpoint inhibitors. I guess I'll reevaluate if my cancer returns or progresses. But for now, I'm relying solely on the vaccine. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the other aspect of this, and this is the first time I'll mention international travel. So recall that this vaccine was really difficult to get here in the US. Had to pay for it, had to find a doctor, had to find a lab, had to find somebody who understood how to put all these pieces together. It was a process. And most importantly, it had to deal with the FDA and their 4 to 6 month delay, and then changing their mind arbitrarily and capriciously, probably, in my opinion, although I can't prove any of that. Anyway, in the meantime, I investigated this vaccine in other countries. And it turns out this is a pretty common treatment in Asia. It's a pretty common treatment in Europe. In fact, in pretty much every other industrialized nation, well, I shouldn't say every other, but in many industrialized nations, it's not that difficult, right? And so I talked to places in Germany and Holland and Asia, and I eventually settled on Japan. And I found a doctor in Japan and the reason why is the doctor I found in Japan, it's two reasons. Number one, I really liked the doctor. I felt like, he was very much concerned about my well-being. It wasn't just intellectual interest. And I've got nothing against the guy who used that term. I'm glad you're intellectually interested in me, trust me. But it made me feel good to find a doctor that his goal was cure, not so, and he was very intellectually curious. The second thing, he had published on this exact thing for many, many years. He was very well known. He's been doing this for 15 years. And he had his own lab, so I didn't, because that's another thing, just the logistics, like it has to be kept at a cold temperature, etc. So I ended up going to Japan. And then the other component of that, why I liked it, is remember that first thing about immune system therapy for cancer that I mentioned, that you have to not be your immune system can't be overwhelmed by the cancer. So again, in my layman's mind, that means you got to have a pretty strong immune system. So part of what they do is NK cell and dendritic cell expansion. And they basically, they do the apheresis. They take the blood, they took my blood, they spin it, they take it to a lab, and they expand those cells, meaning they multiply them. And then they pump billions of new NK and dendritic cells back into me. Now, I don't have good data, but my doctor in Japan tells me that he expects that his procedure probably doubles survival time. And that's good if that's true, but what's even better is that if you can get your cancer early and get this procedure, or if you can get this therapy before the secondary cancers that might be caused by chemotherapy have a chance to take hold, I think a person's odds are way better. Now, in addition to the expansion, like I say, outside the US, it's not that difficult to get a neoantigen peptide vaccine. And there are several different flavors. I can only tell you about what I did. So I basically sent the 6 targets I initially got to Japan, and they said, we'll have this ready for you in 6 weeks, right? And I asked specifically, how can you do this in 6 weeks when it takes 6 months in the US? And he says, because we don't have an FDA. So I went to Japan and I got that therapy first. And then I came back to the US and got the other therapy. Now, because we moved so quickly in Japan, we didn't have time to develop the dozen targets that I got in the US. We had 6 weaker targets, but I think 6 weaker targets is better than nothing. Who knows, that may have bought me some time. And I was also very mindful of the fact that most people, they don't last the 6 months before they get the US vaccine. So I wanted to do everything I could, to beat that clock. I did a couple other things in Japan that is not really common here, but I think it's helpful. Hyperthermia, which is just heat, because cancer cells, I don't know why, honestly. I've heard different theories that I'm not sure about, but I believe it's the mechanical stress of the heat. I did hyperbaric oxygen, which I can do in the US, but that was about it. So given that, like I say, I've got a couple more doses so far. Something seems to be working, and we'll see where I am. The one other metric that I've been testing is circulating tumor cells, and so there's a couple different. Again, there's many different flavors of liquid tests or blood tests as well. There's cell-free DNA, there's circulating tumor DNA, and I get those tests regularly, and nothing has ever popped up. But in addition, I have a circulating tumor cell test, and that's been inconclusive. They're showing that I do have CTCs in my blood, but it's at a super low level and could easily be a false positive. But even if it's not, I'm hoping and expecting that these therapies that I've been getting are going to take care of that. So that's my experience with the vaccine. Check back in with me in a year and we'll see if it worked or not. This is Roger Royse. We'll see you at the next one.